Before we get started, I want to give a huge thanks to my patrons for supporting my videos and other creative endeavors, but also a special thanks to fellow artists Metal Pedal, Sneak, Helenichi, Gilded Wear, Robin Fay, Belt of Orion, Smappy, Myth, Art Amazon, Gentleman Jana, Art Crumbs, and Blue Beetle 4 for their assistance in helping me get all this information together for this video. What up guys, OtterPop here, and welcome to another video about, well, making comics. In my intro video, I explained that a comic is essentially a unique combination of images and text that are read in some kind of sequential order to tell a story of some kind. But before we can even tell that story, before we can even script or draft, we should be selecting, or at the very least experimenting, with the tools of the trade. Now, I'm not necessarily claiming to be an expert in all this. I only create comics as a hobby. Even so, I have managed to pick up a lot of tips and tricks through my own trial, my own error, and experimentation. And a lot of the artists I consulted for this to help with this video, some of whom make comics as more than just a hobby, are in similar boats. Everyone has different experiences with different mediums and tools, and everyone has their own personal preferences. Generally speaking, we can divide these tools between two overarching categories, and that would be traditional and digital. Now, I personally have a lot of experience with traditional mediums, not all, but quite a bit, and thanks to the creators I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I'll also be able to provide some insight on digital mediums, given a little bit of my own experience, but also a lot of experiences of other artists when it comes to comic making, especially from a hobbyist perspective. To start off this video on tools, and before we go digging deep into any of the categories, it's important to know that whatever medium that you do choose to work with is one you are comfortable using, preferably one you already have some experience with for other art projects. While the base of your art style should remain relatively consistent as you make this comic, style changes or even improvements will almost definitely occur over time. Sure, there may be certain styles and mediums that tend to grab people's attention more or could lead to smaller or more dedicated audiences, and maybe you'd rather have your story just be in a specific style. But first and foremost, you should focus on developing your preferred comic medium. Now, I've personally noticed that digital art styles tend to be at the forefront of various comics and webtoons on online platforms, but do not let that deter any traditional artists out there. Traditional comics can definitely be successful. Not only does my own traditionally drawn story get a fair degree of attention, but some of my own comics inspirations are traditionally drawn with substantial followings of their own. Chakra in Africa, as well as Whir and the Warrior Cats comics are primarily hand-drawn with, and they have rather large audiences. Now, traditional comics can come in varying forms. The most common tend to be drawn in only pen or pen in some form of colored tool. My own comic, Hunters, Wolves of the Stormguard, is in the latter category. I use art pens for the outline and colored pencil for all the color you see in the pages. Technically, I use digital edits in a computer program for the panels and the dialogue, but the core of the comic is traditionally drawn with my hands on paper. Speaking of art pens, let's just say there are many different kinds and brands of these tools. Black fine liner pens are the most widely used for art projects due to their versatility and capability when it comes to outlining. Some of the most common and popular brands sold at reasonable prices for indie or single comic artists who are a bit newer at this tend to be Prismacolor, Statler, and Micron, the last of which is a brand that I have been using myself for many years and I'm very happy with them. Copic and Tombow also have very high quality art pens, but these ones tend to be a bit more on the expensive side. Whether you use pen for just the outline like I do or as the entire medium for the whole comic, art pens are very useful because they can come in a wide variety of sizes. For my own Micron art pens, I have at least 10 different sizes just here, and these are not the only sizes. I use varying thicknesses for different lines depending on what element it outlines on the page, as well as how far away it is. A single one of my comic pages could see me using every single one of my art pens at least once because the varying thicknesses give each panel a different kind of depth for the backgrounds and the characters, which can be valuable. But what if you're too nervous about making permanent mistakes with art pen lines? I know that I definitely used to. Well, that's where good old-fashioned art pencils can come in, specifically graphite drawing pencil sets, because there is a variety even in graphite drawing pencils. Most graphite pencil sets out there typically contain a variety of pencils on what's known as the HB scale. If you ever see pencils marked with things like 4H or HB or 7B, this is exactly what I'm talking about. The HB scale refers to hardness, the H, and blackness, the B. Think of an HB pencil as the perfect middle ground, like most of the number 2 pencils you used to use in school. Am I too old for that? But for the rest of them, the larger the number you have on an H pencil, the harder a pencil is, and the greater the clay content. But the larger a number you have on a B pencil, the softer and blacker a pencil is, given the higher graphite content. Various H and B pencils produce different effects and appearances, and experimenting with the different kinds is highly recommended if you're just wanting to stick with paper and pencil, but maybe you want to enhance your pencil drawings a little bit. Artist Loft and Winsor & Newton have plenty of great pencil sets at reasonable prices for those wanting to experiment more with graphite, while Prismacolor, Staedtler, and Faber-Castell tend to be on the pricier but higher quality side. And art pens and pencils are not the only tools that have variety and versatility. Yes, I'm talking about colored pencils as well, since I myself primarily use them. How could I not talk about them? And many of the brands that make graphite pencils also have their colored pencil counterparts. Brands such as Crayola, Artist Loft, and Staedtler are great for newer artists or artists with lower budgets. But if you've got the money and you're wanting to up your game art-wise, then Derwent, Faber-Castell, and Prismacolor, the last of which I personally use for most of my art projects, are some of the most preferred brands by seasoned and professional artists out there. Something you also might want to consider is the type of colored pencil that you want to use if you choose to go this route, because they can either be wax-based or oil-based. Pigments between these two bases can be very similar, but there are some notable differences. Wax-based are by far the most common and the most widely used, and they also tend to be seen as the lower quality of the two types, but don't let the description turn you off from them. Wax pencils can be easier to erase if needed, and their softer cores means that you can adjust the strength and the saturation of the pencil depending on how hard you press. The lighter you press, the more pastel the color appears, and the harder you press, the more deep the color appears. Not only that, but I'd argue it's easier to blend wax-based colors, which I definitely do a lot for my own comic and art projects in general. Oil-based colored pencils, on the other hand, tend to last longer in terms of breakage and color, and they tend to be more effective at coloring finer details compared to wax. Oil-based pencils tend to be a little bit more expensive and sometimes even harder to find, but they are excellent when it comes to layering. Wax-based are also good at layering, but oil-based tend to produce a sharper effect when it comes to layering. But all in all, the type of colored pencil you choose is up to you. You can experiment with different brands as well as different bases, but colored pencils are a fantastic tool to use for traditional comics if that's how you want to go. Moving on from colored pencils, markers are also a similar but useful tool in their own right. Did you ever use those big water-based Crayola markers when you were a kid? Yeah, there are lots more of those kinds of art tools, and a lot of better ones at that. I myself have been experimenting with markers for a couple of my art projects. I should probably do it a little bit more often now that I think about it. Though I haven't been experimenting on the comic front, but I know that some people do use markers with their comics. And I have heard so much praise when it comes to alcohol-based markers such as Copic, I don't exactly know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Tombow, and Winsor & Newton, many of which come in just as much of a variety of colors, even grayscale, as colored pencils can. Whatever type of marker you want to look into, whether it's the bullet or the brush or the chisel, is up to you and your preferences and desire for your own comic. It's helpful to keep in mind that making a comic with markers could take a bit more experience and practice before using, both on a general art front and a comic front. And markers are not the only tricky medium traditional artists may work with for general art projects or comics. There are some artists out there that will use various kinds of paints for their stories. Watercolor, gouache, and acrylic paints tend to be the most favored, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. Regardless of the preference, paints can still be harder to work with and typically require the artist to have some or even quite a bit of experience with before making a comic out of them. All the paints tend to require much thicker canvases, watercolor can get messy, gouache can appear a bit more opaque, and acrylic paint pens can just be a bit more expensive. But make no mistake, paints can be used to make comics. You just might need to get in some practice before, trying to make a story or a comic out of it. And of course, for traditional artists, the right canvas is necessary to select. There are plenty of potential selections to choose from, but what does the industry say about comic making preferences when it comes to canvas size? Well, that's kind of hard to say. Mostly because there isn't exactly an industry standard. I mean, whether you're putting together little strips for the Sunday paper or your own original story for a 100-page comic with complex storytelling or a long vertical episode that'll be made into a webtoon, there isn't really a hard-to-find rule as to what material or size is necessary to print and publish a comic. For my own graphic novel, which I have been working on for over 10 years, Hunters, I have largely used the US letter printer paper, the 8.5 by 11 inches or 216 by 279.5 millimeters, and later the same size from an Artist Loft drawing pad sketchbook. And mostly I use that because that's just kind of what I started out as a young artist. I was starting on my comic pretty soon after I was kind of starting on, general art projects, so I had to go with a basic default. And then, of course, after going so long with that same default, I just kind of stuck with it this entire time. But for a substantial portion of professional or hobbyist comic artists out there, many canvas sizes that they use for their comics tend to have a slightly larger length to width ratio. For both graphic novels and comic books that I've been able to deduce, many artists will use tabloid paper, which is around the 11 by 17 inch size, or 279.5 by 432 millimeters. Another common size that I have seen pop up is the B5 paper standard, which is approximately 7.2 by 10.1 inches, or 183 by 256.5 millimeters. In terms of brands, Bristol board paper tends to be a favorite among professional artists, but for those looking for something with smaller budgets, Blick, Strathmore, Artist Loft, and Canson are also solid brands. I think I've used at least 2 or 3 of these. I'm not sure if I've used all 4. Maybe I have? I can't remember for sure. Of course, brand and size is not the only thing to consider. The material will also need to be dependent on what tools you use for your pages. The thickness of the paper needed depends almost entirely on what the tool you use, and to a smaller extent, how you want your comic to appear. For comics where you use thinner mediums, like, pens and colored pencils like I do, thinner paper works just fine. But for thicker mediums, like, say markers and paints, the correct fit will be for thicker paper, especially one that's tailored specifically to your tool. And most of the sketchbooks and sketch pads out there will indeed have paper that is specific towards specific mediums. It will usually say right on the cover. For simpler comics or ones where spillover is not necessarily considered as much of an issue, consider thick or rough paper, even if only to experiment with. For more extensive comics, say ones with more detail or ones where lines and strokes need to be a bit more carefully considered, such as, with pen outlines, you'll need to look into paper with smooth finishes. If you have an art store near you, go to it and see and feel the differences yourself between the thicker and the rougher paper versus the thinner and the smoother finishes. Switching gears from comic book and graphic novel type of comics, the size and dimensions of comic strips can vary, but typically are square or rectangular depending on the number of panels, or they are elongated in the horizontal direction, usually to fit across the space of a newspaper or column. Now, webtoons do not necessarily have specific dimensions. They are often much more flexible and don't necessarily have defined vertical size limitations or even panel limitations in terms of shapes and size. Whether traditionally or digitally drawn, webtoons don't necessarily have set standards unless those standards are placed upon them by the company or the website through which you publish them, which will require your own bit of research. And of course, traditional artists are free to use other unconventional mediums for their comics, such as, say, pastels or lithography, provided you prefer that style and you know how to use it. But typically in the traditional medium, any combination of pens, pencils, colored pencils, and markers are the most common, the most popular, and the most efficient when it comes to traditionally drawn comics. But these are all just traditional mediums, you must be thinking. And yes, they are. I did say that I have a stronger knowledge of traditional mediums when it comes to comic making and just art in general. But that doesn't mean I don't know or don't have my own resources and experience when it comes to talking about digital comic making, because a lot of people do that. I mean, arguably, digital comics tend to populate platforms a lot more than traditional ones, and that's true for art in general, feels like. Typically, you can approach digital comics in one of 2 ways. A, by drawing the initial sketches and or outlines traditionally and then scanning them and completing them in a digital program, or B, doing everything digitally. But regardless of how you choose to do it, you first need to consider 2 aspects of digital comics, specifically when it comes to tools: the physical tool and the digital one. The physical tool comes in the form of what your hand is actively touching and transmitting to your device, and the digital tool comes in the form of the specific program and functionalities you're working with on said device. So firstly, let's discuss the physical tool. In order to use a device for art, we need tools to interpret our intentions and our movements, and there are a lot of available options, starting with the simplest, easiest, cheapest tool there is: a computer mouse. Now I know what you're thinking. You can use a mouse for art? Yes. That's how a lot of digital artists did it back in the day, and there are still some artists nowadays that use mice for their art projects and even comics. From the lines to the dialogue to the characters to the backgrounds and more. If you have a good mouse, whether Bluetooth connected or it's corded, and a good device to connect to, you can become quite a savant with digital art projects. That said, mice are still probably the least commonly used option out there, but there are still plenty of artists that do use it. Some artists will use touchscreen programs in conjunction with their phones or iPads in order to draw, which can also have its benefits and impressive functionalities on its own. However, what most digital artists out there tend to use above all else are drawing tablets. Drawing tablets typically fall in one of two categories, screenless and display. Screenless tablets, like the one that I currently have, are essentially a large pad which transfers your strokes and movements onto a secondary device like a computer screen. Display tablets have screen displays built into them that don't require a secondary device connection. Both varieties are very common and quite popular for tons of digital artists, including comic makers, and there are various brands that supply both. But which one do you want to look into? Well, there are a lot of factors to consider. Regarding expenses, screenless tablets are often a lot cheaper than those with displays built in, and also tend to last a lot longer as a result, although you can still leave scratches on them. Regarding size, screenless tablets tend to come in a wider variety of sizes than screen ones and often weigh less. This includes a lot of portable options for on-the-go art. But screenless tablets also require a secondary device to connect to, whether it's a phone or a computer or a tablet or something along those lines. But screenless tablets also require a secondary device to connect to, a phone, computer, or tablet, which can often include cables in addition to said secondary device. And having another device tied with your screenless tablet takes some adjustment since you're looking in a different direction from what you're actually drawing on. Heck, I'm still trying to get used to it myself, being primarily traditional for more than 15 years. Screen tablets are much better at bridging the gap between traditional and digital much more easily. Heck, some screen tablets even have accessories that make the display feel like paper so it's easier to draw on for traditional artists that are trying to get into digital. Screen tablets also tend to have a lot more user-friendly functionality, and even if they are bigger and heavier, they are also portable in their own way since they don't require another device to connect to. And there are tons of brands to consider as well for either option. XP Pen tablets, which is what I myself own and use, are a popular brand for newer artists or experienced traditional ones wanting to expand their horizons, like myself. Screenless tablets and XP Pen come at rather inexpensive prices, as do some of their display tablets too. Experienced or professional artists often use Wacom or Huon tablets, which can be a bit pricier, but are very good quality with a high degree of functionality. Even Samsung and Zensia Labs have some decent tablets that artists might use for on-the-go projects from time to time. But many tablets, regardless of brand or type, also often come with varying combinations of dials and buttons for more seamless shortcuts and capabilities. And I cannot mention tablets without also talking about accessories because they are absolutely required when it comes to digital art. When you order these specialized drawing tablets from the above-named brands or from similar ones, many often include a stylus with nubbin replacements. Yes, the removable, changeable tips of the styluses are often referred to as nubbins. Some purchases may even include a thin glove for your hand because the last thing you want to do is constantly have sweat and oil coat your slick drawing tablet and ruin it quicker than necessary. And for this reason, I personally recommend getting a drawing glove if it's not included with the purchase. It doesn't cost much and is absolutely beneficial in the long run. And if the stylus is not included, Apple pens, Galaxy S pens, and bamboo pens tend to be the most favored. Enough talk about the physical tool. Let's talk about the digital tool, because there are a wide variety of solid digital programs out there that are very helpful when it comes to drawing comics and art. If you're looking for something free and open source, GIMP, Krita, and Paint Tool Sci are easy options for newer comic artists out there wanting to make digital comics. GIMP is extremely easy to obtain, but is more geared towards vector art and measurements than comic art, while Krita has a wide variety of tools, but newer artists can get overwhelmed by its huge library of functions and edits, and Sci has good accessibility features, but can be limiting canvas-wise for webtoon creators and potentially other comic creators as well. Even so, these programs have been used for making comics and art projects by other users, and it can still help you with an introduction to digital art making if you're still new to it. If you're already familiar with some digital art programs already, Procreate is a potential program that you can check out as it requires only a single license purchase to own, and it's fairly inexpensive at that. That said, Procreate is only available for certain Apple devices, so Mac users, Windows users, or Android users, sorry. Not only that, but Procreate is not made specifically for comic creation and can only function with certain stylus pens. But it still has its benefits for both amateur and professional artists, including a friendly user interface, a large variety of tools, time-lapse recording functionality, and much more. Adobe products like, say, Photoshop and sometimes even Illustrator have also been used by experienced or professional artists out there. These can sometimes be a bit more expensive and have a lot of tools at their disposal to learn, so a bit of a learning curve, but it can be rewarding to use such a powerful and useful program. But if you're looking for something that is available on multiple kinds of devices, requires only a single payment for a lifetime license, often goes on sale, and is geared in particular towards comic creators and comic creation, Clip Studio Paint is a great program to work with. Of all the artists and all the creators I've had the pleasure of asking advice from on their preferred program, this one stood out far more than any of the others by a long shot. Heck, even on its website, it's referred to as the leading software for comic creation and is even one of the leading programs used for manga in Japan. And that's not all for show. Even with my primarily traditionally drawn comic pages, I personally use Clip Studio Paint to make slight changes to the shades and colors since my scanner doesn't quite scan the image as I see it. In addition to using it for creating dialogue bubbles and text in the easiest and cleanest ways possible. The base program is pretty good, but the EX and the Pro versions offer a lot more useful tools for digital comic creators, and in some cases, since they go on sale as often as they do, they're not terribly expensive for a lifetime license. The biggest con is that there is a lot of functionality to get used to, so if you're a new user of digital art, you may get overwhelmed with everything that you can do, so be forewarned. But that said, because of its popularity as well, there are tons of other users out there, and there are lots of tutorials online. And who says you only need to use one program? Plenty of comic artists out there very often use more than just one program, depending on their styles and their preference for the effects that different programs yield. One artist may use Photoshop for its ease of use when it comes to graphic design and manipulation capabilities, but may also use Blender for creating backgrounds and consistent styles and odd props. Another may prefer Clip Studio Paint for the lines and the dialogue and the page organization, but prefer Photoshop for special effects and color. But someone else may just use Krita entirely for their comic because it was free and they got comfortable with its functionalities even years later. Every artist is different. Every artist has their preferences, has their limits, and much, much more. And for the tools of the trade in the comic world, at least from a hobbyist perspective, that's about all I have to share. There are so many options for styles beyond just traditional or digital, so many brands and mediums to explore and experiment with, and of course, tons of inspiration from many other existing comic artists to look into. I once again want to thank my patrons and fellow artists for helping put together this video, as I definitely could not have done that on my own. And it was fantastic to be working on another one of these because I think myself and others have a lot of ideas and suggestions to share when it comes to making comics. And I also just want to help provide my unique perspective on it since, well, we all have one. And now that you know what comics are and what tools you can use and experiment with, the next video will start to tackle the real art challenges of creating comics. So stay tuned, and as usual, until the next video, guys, check you laters.